Yes, that's it. We begin at noon. Ah, t'as fait partir le truc? Il est moins 5. Ah, il est midi, OK. Bon, ben, mon retard ici est plus grand que je pensais. So, hi everybody, Gwegwe, Wajia, bonjour, good afternoon. I will be alone this week. My colleague Alexandre Nequado is not available today, so you will have to stick with me. But with a very special guest, Gerald McMaster. Gerald McMaster is a teacher, an artist, a critic, and also curator. Is really probably in North America one of the greatest specialists of indigenous visual knowledge and cultures. And so it's really a great honor to welcome you, Gerald, in our podcast in Montreal. Welcome, and please, I don't dare to make your bio. Would take the whole time of the podcast. I try to do it. So I will transfer you this difficult task to present yourself in a few sentences.
Well, thank you, Andre. I think I remember you quite well back, as we said, in the last century. And when I was just beginning in the field of art, I think back in the mid-'80s, and I had taken a project to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and I took a number of artists from Canada, and I believe you were working with Arthur Lamotte at the time, who was a filmmaker, Montreal filmmaker, and both you and he were unable to make it, I think, to Amsterdam. So instead, you contracted a film company out of Paris who met us in Amsterdam, and they followed us for several days, all the artists, and we were interviewed and that. And so that's when I recall our kind of my early memories of meeting you. And you know, it's been a long road since then, since my early days. That was my first international exhibition that I curated. And since then, it seems like every year I'm doing an exhibition of some kind, somewhere. But I'm now at the close of my career, because at the end of this year, I retire from the university. And it seems like I will retire from doing the kind of work I really enjoyed these past 35, 40 years. And I'll be doing other things, you know. I will be, I'm now grandfather, which really
congratulations.
I'm very excited about. So I'm going to be spending time with my grandchild and doing many things. But so thank you, and I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. Yes, I remember when we were working with my old friend Arthur, who is now deceased, and he asked to be buried on Indigenous land. He is in Maliotenam, in the cemetery. The community welcomed him because he did a lot of works with the elders of the nation, the one that have been born and grown on the land, and they were the one who could speak of traditional cultures, and they had a deal with Arthur to transmit by film their knowledge, knowing that the change that were happening would make more difficult to young indigenous, young Innu, to be connected with this ancestral heritage. And one of his last important film is L'écho des songes, Shaman Never Dies. And it was for on contemporary arts, indigenous artists and curators. And it was so difficult in Quebec to have, I remember I often went with Arthur to ask for resources to do the film. And at this time, it was in the mind of many people, it was very difficult to connect contemporary arts and indigenous artists. This was something that was not connected, but already in 1990, 1991, it was something that was really happening in the rest of Canada, as we say here. And you were there at this very beginning of the recognition of indigenous arts by the mainstream institution, museum, galleries, etc.
Yes, I'd like to think that I was, in my young days, as you said, I was there along with the other young artists and curators. Those very early days of trying to say something about what is Indigenous art to institutions that didn't want to hear anything about that. And I recall the film, or at least the name of the film that you mentioned, Shamans Never Die, which is from a painting that was done by Jane Ashpotra, who is an Edmonton-based painter. And when we were doing an exhibition, when I was curating an exhibition in 1992 at the museum in Ottawa, the exhibition was called Indigena. And the exhibition was the first time that Indigenous artists, curators, and by Indigenous, I mean First Nations, Inuit, and Métis artists and writers came together to express a kind of view of the world at the time, because 1992 was the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus. That's what was being celebrated. The country of Canada was celebrating its 125th anniversary. So these two dates, these simultaneous dates, were a bit at odds with Indigenous views at the time. And we felt that we needed to bring this community together to respond to those celebrations, to say, as Indigenous peoples, what do we have to celebrate? So the front cover of the book, because we needed an image that expressed that moment, I commissioned Jane Ashpotra to create a work, and she created this painting called Shamans Never Die, which was a kind of interesting title when I think about it, because really what it suggested that for many, many years since the late 19th century, we're talking about centuries now, and Indigenous peoples there had been a system of cultural erasure by the federal government. And so from about 1870s to the 1950s and 60s, when Indigenous people started to come back and start to rethink about who they are, their identity, their culture, what is left that's around. And so this notion of Shamans Never Die was the fact that perhaps our cultures were really sleeping, and they had gone underground. And so the language and the stories had this ability to survive because they weren't that visible. as dances and ceremonies and giveaways are more visible. So the government was able to keep an eye on that and to dissuade that from Indigenous communities. But language, stories, those are oral, those are passed on. So when you think of this idea that something is really never died, but rather just went to sleep, and in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s, was that now it was coming back to life, and that artists were leading that charge. They were leading the direction. And so this exhibition at the time of 1991 was important. And as you say, there were probably very few individuals besides Arthur Lamont who was interested in what was going on at the time, and doing a film and doing projects with Indigenous artists in those early days was really important. And it's taken now, since the 80s and 90s, and only recently in the last 15, 20 years, where the country itself has really taken a radical shift in which artists, there are many more artists, great artists, Indigenous artists across the country. And there's young curators who are now engaged in doing exhibitions and traveling around the world and doing exhibitions. So things have changed certainly since my day, and really nice to see. Yes.
Yeah. And also, you are one of those who brought that change, that make it possible by your works and by your fights and by your writing. We can make now a big jump in time and speak about today. You are at the OCAD University. Can you speak about how this university about arts and design and open to indigenous cultures, and what you accomplished there?
Okay, I am a professor at OCAD University, and OCAD stands for the Ontario College of Art and Design University. It is the largest art and design university in Canada, has something like 4,000 plus students who come from around the world. And right now, of course, with COVID, much of our courses are done online. So we have students from around the world and many time zones in which we speak. And I came about 7-8 years ago to OCAD University to the position which I now fill, which was an important position because it's the first time that OCAD University was given a Canada Research Chair. And so I now occupy that Tier 1 Canada Research Chair at OCAD University. And what that means is that it has allowed me to build up a research center devoted to Indigenous art, curatorial practice, and we call it Wapatah, Center for Indigenous Visual Knowledge. And Wapatah is a Cree. I'm originally from Saskatchewan, so I approached our elders and knowledge keepers to come up with a word that would describe the kind of things that we do. And so they brought to me this concept called visual knowledge, or this way of condition of seeing, and I felt that was a tremendous breakthrough. When I think of my career in the arts, it seemed like that what my studies, my reading, my writing always appeared to be from, even though it was done by an Indigenous person myself, I kept thinking that perhaps speaking in English, or if you're speaking in French, and learning art history, that's the perspective that you write from. That's the perspective that you see from. And so when I was beginning to investigate, working with linguistic specialists back home, who gave me this this concept, excuse me, they gave me this concept called Wapatah, which is the condition of seeing, the condition of looking. And when I think about that, I really began to think that, and as I spoke with them more, they kept telling me that you don't start from English, don't start from another language to do translation. Your basis is from an Indigenous perspective, and then go outward. And so, trying to find a word for art, trying to find a word for culture is literally impossible when you think about that. So there's no use even trying to find a translation. So this idea of starting from an Indigenous footing and perspective and going outward was, to me, such a liberating moment and opportunity, because first of all, I was a bit apprehensive in doing that because there was no such thing as visual knowledge, really, when you look for it in dictionaries or online or somewhere. So I was somewhat apprehensive in using this term, but as I thought about it more, and I thought, well, maybe that's where I begin from, and not be overly apologetic, because if we're to begin thinking from Indigenous perspectives, we have to start from that footing. We have to start from that ground and be unapologetic and just work with it. And you know what? I have started to think that way, started to write that way, started to try and use Cree concepts and work outward. And it's been liberating. I've been able to discover certain perspectives and voices within the Cree, albeit it's translated into English, of course. But it was a position for me to begin thinking about. And so calling the center, just the simple form is Wapatah, which is to see. The Center for Indigenous Visual Knowledge has been, as I said, very, very liberating. And so it's allowed us to do all sorts of projects. Right now, I'm just working on a project which will be opening this fall in September at the Power Plant Gallery of Contemporary Art here in Toronto, in which I'm bringing artists from the circumpolar Arctic, from Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and the Scandinavian countries, bringing those artists together with artists from the Amazon, from Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, and writers from those two areas, and bringing them together in this huge project. We're calling it Arctic Amazon Networks of Global Indigeneity. And so thinking about that as an opportunity for the Wapatah Center has been really important, because what it allowed us to do is think that connecting global Indigenous peoples, particularly in the arts, was important and critical. Even though that's happening today, there's exhibitions now all around the world where Indigenous artists are coming together. But we felt this was solely in the Americas, despite the fact that we have artists from Greenland and Scandinavia. Nonetheless, it's this kind of north-south connection in which the Indigenous peoples of the Americas are speaking together and connecting with one another. We have done symposias, we've done online, since COVID, we've done online conversations such as, and these are all on YouTube, for example. So we've done a whole series called Indigenizing the Art Museum, in which I interviewed curators and directors from art museums in Canada and the United States, and their view of how they are the field of art within their own institutions. As I say, it's in the field of art. And I think that that's, to me, a very radical move. And so that's the kind of things we've been doing. We hosted a number of years ago a symposium, again, of Arctic Amazon artists we brought together. Another time we did a conference, which has been near and dear to my heart, a conference of scholars in which we brought together people from around the world to talk about Indigenous perspectives by artists of Europeans, or of the other. See, up until now, as you know, Andre, we are used to seeing representations of us, whether it's in art, in textbooks, films, in, well, you name it. It's always this outsider view of who we are. And we see that in museums and on film everywhere. But never have we seen, well, how do Indigenous peoples look at Europeans, Euro-Canadians, Euro-Americans, right? Or just people from other parts of the world. We've never seen that. And so it's been a project I've been working on for a couple decades now. And we had a conference called the Entangled Gaze, which is this idea of the complexity of how we see each other and how we look at each other. And so that was a project. We produced a scholarly journal from that with the various papers from that. We've done written and edited text for films and documentaries. So in the 7 years that I've been there, we've done quite a bit. We do have a website, wapatah.com, WAPATAH.com. And you can see all the projects that we've done and all the different the research assistants we've had over the years. And so it's been an interesting 7 years, and I don't know where it's going to go from now on. But that's what I've been doing at OCAD University. Besides teaching, and besides doing that, I've been teaching courses in Indigenous Visual Art Studies, criticism and curatorial studies. I've been teaching in that course, and this year I've been teaching in a critical theory in which I'm looking at perception and how people look at each other. So that's what I've been doing these past few years at OCAD University.
Yes, I will insist to our listener to go to the website, WAPATAH, n'oubliez pas le H, WAPATAH.com, WAPATAH.com. This is a fantastic site. You have a lot of writing. You have a conversation on YouTube live stream. You have a lot of documentation and links about Indigenous art. This is really a treasury chest, important if you are interested in Indigenous art. And thank you, Gerald, to have mentioned it and to have taken care of this is really a great work. And I am amazed how this kind of reflection is continental. It's not we have in Montreal First People Festival since many years connection with university, now mainly Queen's University, to have each year international conference about Indigenous cinema and the way of seeing the world from an Indigenous perspective. And I remember it struck me when I read, it was not an Indigenous work, but probably one of the main intellectual works of the 20th century, the mythology of Claude Lévi-Strauss, the French ethnologist. And he take the same stories, creation stories, all kind of mythological stories from various indigenous places all around Americas, and he connect them and he can explain how structurally they are connected and how this is somehow the same background from every particular indigenous way of life or in particular culture, very, very different in their creation, manifestation. But when you go deep enough, you can discover how they all interconnected. And also, I founded the festival in 1990, and this is an international festival where Indigenous from all over Americas and all over the world come. And right now, I know you were also one of the first at the Biennale Venice. I think you were there in 1995, if I remember well. But right now, at the Biennale of Venice, there is a focus on, and since the last 2, 3, 4 Biennale, this is the most famous in the world. There is a focus on Indigenous artists, contemporary art artists. And right now at the Semi Pavilion, I know that Wanda Nanabush is there to collaborate on, and the opening was this week or last week, if I remember well.
Yes.
So this is a big accomplishment, a big step from what we knew before.
It's a huge step. And when we think that well, Venice is an interesting place because the Biennale itself is based on national pavilions. And I think back in 1995, when I was working with the artist Edward Poitras, we represented Canada. And so each of the countries around the world has their own pavilions. And in those days, of course, there was very little interest in Indigenous art or artists. In fact, there were very few people that attended from Canada that you'd say were Indigenous. I know there were my family and my cousins, basically, were the ones that attended that one could say that they had a close connection. But things have changed, over the years. Slowly, you find more Indigenous artists coming, whether it's from Australia or whether it's from New Zealand, representing their countries, and there's some interest. When I was working with the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian back almost 20 years ago, we would rent spaces in and around Venice. And we would work with a couple American artists from the US, Indigenous artists, and put their exhibits there, which was in proximity of the Biennale of Venice. They called them collateral events, and so we did that. But over the years, there have been more and more interest in going. As I said, it's a national interest. Other biennales from around the world, the biennales are exhibitions, international exhibitions that take place every 2 years. These are now happening everywhere in the world. There's one in Toronto right now. But there are different kinds. But Venice is special because Venice is old. It's been going on since 1895. When Edward and I were there in 1995, it was the 100th anniversary year. But since then, there's been more and more interest. I think, as I said, the interest in Indigenous presence of artists from around the world. And this year, having the Sami, 3 Sami artists being selected to represent the Scandinavian countries, and in turn, they call it the Sami Pavilion. I'd like to think that they got the idea that from what I did with back in 2018, when I was working with 18 Indigenous architects at the Venice Architectural Biennale, in which we weren't just representing Canada. In fact, we took down the border. We ripped the border down and said, nope, this pavilion is going to be an Indigenous pavilion, and it's going to represent Canadian and American-based architects. So we had 18 architects from across Turtle Island, because we felt that we shared so many ideas, and we shared cultures, we shared ideas, we shared space, we shared history, so much was shared, and that we felt that we went as one group, and there was, as I said, 18, and I felt that that was an important opportunity. But we didn't have the numbers again of people going. There were a number of Indigenous peoples that were there, which was really, really good. Artists and probably young architects were there. But this year, the Sami, I think, has somehow connected with Accord, because I think they're in Europe, and I think Europeans tend to establish these kinds of positions. And I think the wake-up call perhaps is important, and their presence, to have them there and exhibiting as a group to express their indigeneity in Europe. Because I'm sure Europeans are trying to figure out, we have Indigenous peoples in Europe? and certainly I think the Sami, their presence is going to bring a kind of presence to a global Indigenous world that had been started years ago. But now this year it's a little different, and there's crowds of people going and supporting the Sami, which is really, really great. And I wish them well. And in fact, one of the artists that is in the Sami Pavilion is going to be in the Arctic Amazon exhibit this coming fall. And her name is Marit and Sarah. And she's one of the artists that we will have in the exhibition.
You just mentioned, and I think it was important, you were in pioneer there too, the famous on the Capitol Hill in Washington, the famous museum, and that have been long to establish, but and you were there also, and this is a place where, well, Douglas Cardinal, the architect, was Canadian, donc already in this very famous museum in the making, the frontiers between different parts of America were not considered. The indigeneity was embrace the whole hemisphere, the whole hemispheric world of Turtle Island. Can you speak about your experience in at the museum?
Sure. And I wanted to kind of connect with what you said earlier. You were referencing Claude Lévi-Strauss, the French anthropologist who theorized this notion of structuralism, and that somehow Indigenous people share, there's certain traits that we share. I think that's an important idea. But I also wanted to say that there are many differences, of course, amongst Indigenous peoples. And I think, and why do I say that? When we were doing the exhibitions for the opening of the National Museum of the American Indian in 2004, my curators, because I was overseeing all the curators, and they were working with Indigenous communities across the Americas, from the Arctic all the way to Tierra del Fuego and communities in between. There were 24 of them that we worked with on 3 major exhibitions on 3 floors. One exhibit dealt with philosophy, another one dealt with history, and the third one dealt with identity. So there were 8 different exhibitions within each of those pods, those thematic ideas. But it's the first one, the one on philosophy, that I think really got me thinking about this notion, as you were saying, about Lévi-Strauss' notion of a structuralism, and how there's a kind of similarities that we share. And so we can quickly begin to see almost not quite a stereotype that we all think alike, that we all are thinking in circles, for example. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And I think what we discovered in working with Indigenous peoples, that Indigenous peoples from different parts of this world, even in Canada, don't all think the same. yes, we're Indigenous, but yet culturally we're so distinct from one another. You know, so, yes, some Indigenous peoples do have the concepts of circularity of the four directions, for example, and so that's fine. But yet, when you go to another part of the land, you'll find Indigenous peoples don't even think that way. They're thinking more about uh, uh, two sides, like the mountain side and the ocean side, right? So this is what's behind you and then what's in front of you. And then there's another set of cultures who think of above, high and low, basically, what's in the mountains and what's in the valleys, you see. And then others who will think more in terms of a square, of this kind of square feature. So I guess, but what I'm saying is that the structures, the cosmology, the ways of thinking of Indigenous peoples are vastly different from each other, because it's perhaps where their land is, where the relationships with the land, the relationship with different animals, just the world is so different and vast from one another that you start to think quite differently and see the world quite differently. So even some of the stories, stories of creation are vastly different from each other. Indigenous peoples share creation stories, but they're different, So I guess I just was thinking, and I unfortunately haven't studied Levi-Strauss enough to say whether he's right or wrong. But I think he had some interesting thoughts. I think he worked primarily in Brazil, and then he did some work on the Northwest Coast in Canada. But to cover the land and as I said, my experience in working with the curators and working with Indigenous peoples across the land and giving them the agency and authority to speak from their perspectives was so critical. And then what that allowed is that visitors coming through would then look at these different cultures and really begin to see the vast differences amongst them, not only just in their philosophy, but in their histories as well, and their relationships with outsiders. That was also interesting. And then how they express their identities. I think that was as well quite eye-opening. So doing and opening up in a museum like this, as we did, was a bit unpopular. And why do I say that? Well, the press who reported on it at the opening, it didn't meet their own expectations. In other words, it didn't meet the kind of things that they expected that Indigenous peoples would be, the kind of exhibitions that we should have. Maybe should they all be about art and visuality, or should they be about the kind of ethnographic views that were always present in museums? No, we said that we wanted to represent this notion of voice, that Indigenous peoples have the authority to express their views and their histories, their philosophies, and their identities. And I think that that's what was different. And so it just, I don't think the critics knew how to respond to that, because only later did some of them begin to understand what the exhibitions were and why they were like that. But I still think, nonetheless, it was an important, and I think that's what exhibitions do. They change. Hopefully they change people's views and thinking, that a conversation can be begun, rather than always to cement people's views of who we are, right? To always say, oh, that's how Indigenous people think. Now I feel good about it, rather than say, oh, I didn't realize you think that way. You have a very different view than what I thought. So I think that challenging, opening up people's perspectives and minds to new thinking, I think that that's what exhibitions, that's what these projects are about. And I think the National Museum of the American Indian did that, and is hopefully continuing to do so. And I think it was really a good opportunity for me to contribute to the new museum. when it opened in 2004.
Yeah, it's almost cliche to say that, but to say that when the critics are against you, that's a good sign. But I would say that in this particular case, it is obviously a good sign, because if you bring a new perspective that is not that the people that are walking in the old way are not able to understand at first sight, it means that you are changing things and the mind. And of course, it takes time, and it can hurt at first contact. But slowly, the visitors and the people going into the museum are learning and to look and to listen differently, because they had prejudice that are, and the prejudice are mostly unconscious. This is not something that is reasonable, right? That's something that you live with. All of a sudden, there are challenges. Of course, there is a shock when it happens.
Well, when you think about when we think of our countries, both Canada and the United States, you realize that in Canada, the visibility of Indigenous peoples is far greater. The percentage is far greater. So, just reading about Indigenous news in the paper, in the national newspaper, seeing them on television, there's nothing new. Whereas in the United States, is still, because of the vast numbers of Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, you find that the percentage of numbers of Indigenous peoples is still quite low. And Americans, I think Indigenous Americans will say that a lot of people still see us very differently, and they still want to pigeonhole us into a past that was totally false and foreign. And that so they've been struggling a lot more for that visuality, that presence. And so having exhibitions like that try to challenge their views has been a struggle. And they still continue to do exhibitions in which that tries to challenge those viewpoints of how the American public sees them, because they're just almost totally invisible, So because they are located in centers that are on the periphery, except perhaps if you go to the American Southwest, where Indigenous people are fairly visible, in New Mexico and Arizona. But the rest of the places, you start to see that, in fact, Indigenous peoples are quite invisible. And so it's been a struggle. And I think that the museum being located on the mall in Washington has been important. And they will continue to produce projects, which I hope that reaches the public in new ways. So it's been a long time since I've been there. I enjoyed my time when I was there to leave my work here in Canada to go there to work with them, to help them open up their new museum, was something that was important for me to do. And I think that I learned a lot from that experience. And, I bring things back here to Canada from that experience.
Yes. But we have to say, in the United States, they are invisible because they are pushed away of course, physically. They were moved. There was an ethnic cleansing in the United States that happens in the 19th century. And now I think the culpability in the guiltiness in the American psyche make that they don't want to see their own history in their own reality. That's why, because if you look at the percentage, there is a lot of Indigenous persons. We are not that numerous in Canada neither. So I think that this is a sociological situation, and I don't think the numbers there is that important. I think it's more sociological exclusion that are happening, and obviously this is the museum is certainly a challenge to that oblivion of Indigenous history, cultures, and contemporary realities.
Well, that said, I think that the it's always about narrative, isn't it? You know, when we think of what the American narrative is, like say even the Canadian narrative, and who tells that narrative, right? And I think that that's that being the challenge with the Americans is trying to tell an American Indian or Indigenous American narrative story that fits within the U.S. because the U.S. narrative is so strong in the minds of the people that seemingly it's really just the black and white narrative that has any strength, and then you have this kind of South American, Mexican American influence of that into that stronger narrative. So, as you said, this kind of ethnic cleansing of Indigenous peoples in the early 19th century, it just seems like Indigenous peoples have disappeared from that narrative. And they only fit the narrative that's at the beginning when the US was beginning, but they don't enter anywhere else at all, you know. And I think that that's been the struggle of museums and institutions, is to try and have a contribution to the greater narrative. And it would be interesting to see what some of the mainstream museums in the US are doing, because at this point they just might say, oh, the American Museum of the American Indian is telling the story, so we don't have to tell it, you know. But I would argue they should tell it, you know. And similarly, in our own institutions in Canada, you know, I think that those narratives, whether it's the National Gallery, the Canadian Museum of History, or any other, the smaller institutions, they also need to, and they have begun to incorporate an Indigenous narrative that is not a segregated narrative, but a story that is told, right? That integrates those stories, and to try and tell a more truthful narrative. And certainly since the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, we begin to now are readjusting that narrative, because it's been such an influential report that that now institutions across this country are really starting to make those major shifts. But I would argue it's not the same as in the US. I think Canada, people would say, oh, we're far ahead, but I mean, we still have our own struggles, obviously, but nonetheless, I think the influence that we're having on our own narrative has been far greater here than it is in the United States.
Yeah, I remember me in 2001, we wanted to underline the tricentennial of the Great Peace of Montreal of 1701. And nobody was remember this great diplomatic event that shaped the North America as we know it today. Mm-hmm. And the reason is because it is the indigenous diplomacy that created that situation. And obviously, with we had enough impact in 2001 that now it's all in the scholar program, and it is remember. People often refer Montreal, not Indigenous land, and the place where the Great Peace of 1701 have been signed. So this is something we have reestablished, and I know that more and more at in not only in cinema and theater, but in all the field of arts and history, we are speaking about narrative sovereignty, which means that we have to reestablish our own way of seeing the history, because history is not only the facts, it's the facts that you remember and how you remember them. It's not like the physics or the chemistry, a very strict science. There is also a way of telling the story and the historical facts that are really different from different point of view.
I agree. I think that as I said, I think there's been a shift in the last 5 to 10 years in how we tell that narrative, and I think more and more now institutions are aware. Even just simple things like, when we think of so many people are now doing these land acknowledgements, I think that it's a kind of a nod to an Indigenous presence, and that they're part of the narrative. And just by simply saying that, the awareness factor really increases. And I think it's done in most everywhere in this country now, which has been quite positive.
A big change also I see since the last century. I remember when we were younger that there was a big discussion. Right? Many contemporary artists were saying, well, I am an artist first of all, and I happen to be Indigenous. It was like and I think it was a way to make to try to enter and to be recognized by the mainstream institution at the time. But now it seems that the shift have changed. The people are more speaking about how to indigenize art, how to indigenize galleries, and how to, when curating art shows, how to have this, to bring this Indigenous perspective. Did you agree that this is a shift in the way we see ourselves as artists, curators?
Well, yeah, to some degree, I agree. I think that there was that moment in which Indigenous artists were, first of all, trying to discover themselves as Indigenous peoples, and then realizing that strategy wasn't working in the art world. So they felt that maybe they must shift that strategy, that position, to say we are artists first and Indigenous second, And so that worked for a number of years, I think, until more recently, as you say. I think that there's more artists are more comfortable in stating who they are. And I must say that that there's another kind of shift that's one in which artists do state that when we think of the question of identity now, it's not a singular identity that people have or a singular heritage that people have, but rather you'll discover that people are more comfortable in addressing their mix, their métis, their métisness, their métissage, or whatever the terms may be, but that people come from various heritages and that they're influenced by these heritages. People grow up in so many different circumstances and contexts and places. No longer are they from one area, an Indigenous group from one area, but they may live across the country but their ancestors come from another area. So this kind of flux of being, I think, is something that's being addressed by young people, and they're just saying now that, well, I'm more comfortable in who I am and where I come from, and just the fact that my heritages are more than one. And but I think significantly, I think there's still I think the pride in having an Indigenous connection for many is still important. There's a number of Canadians and artists and perhaps curators who might have a small percentage of Indigenous heritage, but to them it's gigantic. It plays a far greater role in who they are than the other heritages. So it's I think how we see each other today is, I think people are much more comfortable in not necessarily hiding who they are, but rather expressing the complexity of their heritage, their identity, their self, and they're a bit more unapologetic about that, because it's the nature of being human and living in a country that's a very complex nation, and it's changing all the time. And I think the arts have something to do with that, maybe. And so it's, I think, to me, I think that the artists now, who knows where they'll go tomorrow? I have no idea. I'm just kind of sensing where they are today based on the kind of histories that we came out of. And I think there's an important story there, right? The narrative of how the shifts are and how people have come to be. And I think it's for some reason it's in the arts. I can't think of other fields of endeavor where identity is so debated all the time about who you are. But I've always known in the arts, there's been debates about identity issues, and but now, yes, we might see them in film. As you're in an area of film, and I notice there've been debates about people's identity, whether they're Indigenous or not, or what percentage are they, or who can call themselves Indigenous. I mean, they're important questions, but the contexts are different each time you talk about that.
Yes, obviously the debate, has taken place in the Quebec too, and sometimes it's okay, but sometimes it's clash, and I don't think it's it's not often productive, because identity is something so complex. You cannot just give a portrait of a person only by his blood quantum or his identity card. Each human being is very particular and with many heritage and many ways to connect to part of those traditions and ancestry. So it's not. It's part of the fabric of the society, and it is something fantastic, that diversity, but also it makes things more complicated, obviously. Especially that it's something that we want, that now the big institution like Téléfilm Canada or Conseil Canadian Art Council have Indigenous program, and the argument behind this was that exactly the notion of arts can vary if you are from an indigenous background, or if you are more on an occidental background. And that's where I think the divide began, because who is able to access those programs? That's where mainly the clash happened. And I guess it's the same thing in the universities too.
Yeah, it's I've been trying to think about kind of the histories of how we came into these arguments, and one of the things that I like to think about is what was life like in the 19th century or the 18th century when our cultures and the indigenous peoples across this country were strong in their language, their culture, their being, and their sense of self was very, very strong, and where they would have constant contact and connections with newcomers, settlers, Europeans, Euro Americans, where they traded material, they traded for goods, and artists were influenced by the new material that was coming in from Europe. Sometimes new ideas would enter into the communities. But I always kind of thought that, you know, when you are strong in your language and your culture, you have a particular attitude and a view towards the world where it's always one of strength, and where you feel that you are what's the word I'm trying to find? Where the impact on you is far greater, and where one thinks that, let's say, what I'm trying to say is that with the imposition of the laws like the Indian Act, which was all about a cultural erasure, and which happened over a 70-year period over generations, what we find is that the generations of the 50s and 60s and 70s was vastly different from what it was in the 19th century. And so because so much was erased, our people in that time period were trying to recover what was erased, what had been taken away from them, whether it's the objects, whether it was the songs or any parts of the culture. So they felt this, we needed to recover that. And so we started to think in terms of what is traditional, how did we do things based on what our ancestors did. And so you had this notion of that some people knew more about the culture than others. Others knew more about the tradition than others. Others knew certain languages greater than others. So you kind of had a bit of competitiveness and view about this situation. And so, to me, when I think of our ancestors in the past, to me, they had always been present in the moment. There was no fear of losing something or having something erased. So you were readily accept outside ideas, outside material, and you continue to express who you are with no sense that there's going to be an impact, But then, of course, with the cultural erasure that happened in the 20th century, and then we look back at the past, then you realize that this recovery has had an impact on our thinking, and I'm wondering, this notion of being modern is ancient. It's we have to start thinking differently, I guess, is what I'm thinking about, and how we use the terminology that we use, and how it impacts us, and what fears we might have and apprehensions about things disappearing again or being erased from your cultural memory. And so I think we to some degree we live in a bit of a fear of that happening again. And I think our communities are working hard to maintain that level of a relevance and importance for the younger people, for future generations, and hopefully we can recover from that and be strong again, and where we don't have we get into those kinds of arguments about cultural loss and who is more Indigenous than the others, but rather we just feel comfortable in who we are, and as our ancestors did, because they were strong, they had everything, despite the fact that yes, our numbers were getting less and less because of disease or warfare or treaties where our land were being taken away. But nonetheless, I think there was a different kind of attitude to our ancestors than perhaps what we're feeling today sometimes. But I mean, I have hope, of course, that we're living in a good age where we don't have to worry about that too much any longer. I think our peoples are strong, and communities are working really hard. I can see it everywhere, both in the arts and the cultural industry, and linguistic specialists are working hard to recover the languages, and maybe there is something there that we need to look at and delve further into our culture and our history.
I would like also to, because when we had the idea to have you at this podcast, it was we see your declaration about in Rome, in the Vatican, all the indigenous artifacts and collections they have there, and you ask for more access to repatriation of some of them. And I think it's very important because now the Pope seems to finally takes the responsibility of the Church to acknowledge how all the wrong they did with residential schools. So can you explain your point of view about those indigenous collections in Rome?
Yeah. The basic story is that it goes back to what I was saying earlier about my area of interest, about discovering how Indigenous peoples represented the other Europeans, Euro-Canadians, New Settlers, whatever. And so a number of years ago, I was doing some research in various museums across Europe and in Canada. I had a special grant to do so. And, the museums in Europe opened up for me, and which was fantastic. And I had an opportunity to see so much and to tell the institutions what they had, because they had no idea what they had. So me just going to the museums and pointing out what important works that they had in their collection was really important for me and for them. And so I visited around 40 museums across Europe. And as I was saying, when I was doing the Venice Architectural Biennale in 2018, I felt there was an opportunity, perhaps, now that I'm going to be in Italy, I should go see some of the museums, like in Florence, for example. There was another town, I can't remember the name of it, in northern Italy that I visited. It's near Milan. But I also felt that Rome had museums. The Pigorni Museum in Rome was an important museum that I felt I needed to visit. But also the Vatican. Now, why the Vatican? Well, I did know from some research and also talking with Indigenous folks that the Vatican had some collections that I wanted to see. I remember years ago working with an Indigenous Mi'kmaq scholar who told me that there was a wampum belt there, I believe it was from 1831, I think it was created, and that was given to the Pope, I believe, at the time. And so it's been there, and they've been, he said he'd been working years and years trying to see it, and the Vatican would not allow them to see the belt. And I think it's well written about in certain papers. And it had images of that kind of relationship between Europeans and Indigenous peoples, which I was really quite interested in seeing. But, and as I've read stuff over the years where I'd read something to say, this community gave something to the priest, which was then to be given to the Pope, for example. And in my research over the years, what I have found is that there have been various representations of Jesus Christ on the cross, or some kind of representations of Christianity. And I felt, well, the Vatican, the center of the universe for Catholicism and Christianity, and with this vast collection, surely they have something in their collections. And it's for that reason alone that I was interested in seeing what they had in their collection. So I tried by emailing, by telephoning. I even had Italian research assistants, both here in Toronto and one in Rome, trying to help me to get into see the curator, but to no avail. I had scholars in Europe helping me, perhaps because they've worked with the Vatican. I had a museum director from Genoa who knew people, etc. So I was trying all sorts of ways to access the collection, but to no avail. And so a Canadian journalist called me one day and wanted to know my story, and that's how it got into the news prior to the delegation going to Rome to see the Pope. And I was told that the delegation was going to see the collection. But, I think they only got as far as the exhibitions that are in the Vatican, an exhibition called what is it called? Something Mundi. Anima Mundi, I believe it is. Everything that is living is connected. I think that's the phrase. And my sense is that's all they got to see. I don't think they got to go behind the collections, which is where I'm interested, and I have been interested in seeing. So when they were asked of me, what do I want to see from this visit of the delegation that's going? What could be the future? And I said, well, I think that first thing is that Indigenous peoples across this country have been going to museums around the world, trying to locate works that come from their communities. And I said that, it'd be great if they opened it up to Indigenous communities to come and see what they have. Secondly, I'd like to see the Vatican open its collections to scholars such as myself and there's a lot of non-Indigenous scholars who I'm sure want to gain access. I do know there's some Indigenous scholars that have gained access to the collection, but there needs to be more. And thirdly, I said, the potential for, and I know some Indigenous people are talking about repatriation, about bringing things back that may be sacred or of what they would call objects of cultural patrimony. But I said, repatriation is a long process. It's a more difficult process that it'll take years. And so it may be totally impossible, but that's a stage. That's an opportunity that I think could be had. And fourthly, I said, it would be, how could you, because we use the term these days of decolonizing, whether it's decolonizing a museum or an art museum or institutions in this country. And I said, the Vatican could also be decolonized. And how could it be decolonized? Well, they could invite scholars, they could invite communities to come and see what's in their collection, to help them identify what's in their collections, maybe help them put them online to correctly identify objects, to do research on it. And I said, there's maybe, and because they have a museum there, I think Indigenous curators could help them do exhibitions, right? So they can be decolonized in a number of different ways. So those were some ideas that I suggested that could be had and could be done into the future. And I think it's important that now that the Vatican has shaken hands with Indigenous peoples in a diplomatic way, and perhaps one that will be done in a way that recognizes the experience that all Indigenous, our ancestors have gone through, of this idea of cultural erasure, because the church is largely implicated with the government in a cultural erasure. So I think they should also be on the side of working with Indigenous peoples, on the side of recovery and retention, and all the other words that begin with RE, like repatriation. And I think that those are things that the Vatican can do. But I do know it's a huge institution. There's billions of Catholics around the world, and that opening up the vaults to small numbers of people from North America, I think is last on their list. But hopefully we've moved up the list where they can at least answer their emails, answer their phone calls, and where we can make appointments to come and see the collection. I think it's not asking for much. And that's what I'd like to see happen.
Well, let's hope that some bishop or cardinal is listening to our podcast and can open the door.
I said I said to somebody one day, I said, I'm going to pray to my Great Spirit, and perhaps my Great Spirit will talk to their Great Spirit and reach down into somebody in the Vatican and wake them up and answer the phone.
Yes, I knew they have those codex of very, very rare book by Indigenous knowers that were written by the Spanish conquistador at the first contact, and they have few pages of the codex, very, very precious. You can find it in dictionary and encyclopedia. That's well known, but I didn't know they have that huge amount of Indigenous arts or artifacts. That was new for me. And I know, see, in Lyon, France, it was not that huge like Vatican, but the Musée des Confluences there, they did that work. They had a lot of objects that came from missionaries from Lyon that were all over the world, in Africa, in America, and in Asia. And they asked community scholars and different tradition bearers to come and help them to make an inventory and to help them also to how to present correctly and use correctly all those collections they have. So the path is there. The Vatican wouldn't be the first to do that. They only have to follow the road that has been opened by other museum. I think now we reached the end of the podcast. Gabriel, on va avoir besoin de toi. I want just finishing by remembering that in 1992, it was the first time. It was not the first festival. It was the second one, but the first one we had no money to make a poster. But in 1992 we had some money and we did the poster. I thought I had the copy here. I didn't find it. I should have brought the one I have at my apartment. But anyway, I want to remember it. This, we use a fantastic work of art entitled Conversation with 3 Point. And the artist was Gerald McMaster.
Boy, I can barely remember that moment.
So we have kept the connection, and of course, with all the works you are doing, you can consider Montreal also as a place to where you can exhibit, where you can work, where you can. We have a lot of venues, and now we are recognized, Terres en Vue and Insights, as cultural, almost a cultural institution in the city. So we can easily make the ground easier for Indigenous artists or curators. So keep in mind that you can contact us anytime or visit us. It will be a great pleasure to have you in Montreal. And that was really a great moment to this short conversation we have together.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Okay, so I will say to our listener, next week, same time, each Wednesday at noon, we are there, and follow up on YouTube, and you will see who will be our next guest. Almost as interesting as Gerald McMaster. Thank you, Gerald.
Thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you